There are many other legends Ibn Khaldun thoroughly unmasked in his Muqaddimah, like the story of a city entirely made of copper, which Ibn Khaldun says is economically and physically unrealistic. Anyway, last but not least, here is an anecdote Ibn Khaldun narrates about the stories of his contemporary, the famous Ibn Battuta, one of the greatest travelers of all time, who was frequenting the same court in Fes in the mid-13,000s. Back then, Ibn Battuta was a seasoned 50-year-old traveler who has been to lands as far and diverse as Persia, China, the Swahili coast, India, the Maldives, Sumatra, Mecca, Anatolia, or Mali, whereas Ibn Khaldun was a young, inexperienced administrator in his early 20s. Ibn Khaldun reported that in the same court of Fes, many were those who did not believe in Battuta's stories. Quote unquote. A sheikh from Tangier by name Ibn Battuta came back to the Maghreb. 20 years before, he had left for the east and journeyed through the countries of the Iraq, the Yemen, and India. He spoke mostly about the ruler of India. He reported things about him that his listeners considered strange. That, for instance, when the ruler of India went on a trip, returned, and entered the city again, it was a festive day. In front of the ruler, in the crowd, mangonels were set up on the back of pack animals. From the mangonels, bags of money were shot out over the people, until the ruler entered his audience hall. Ibn Battuta told other similar stories, and people in official positions whispered to each other that he must be a liar. End of quote. Ibn Khaldun, although very young at that time, also had his doubts. But he learns that, as incredible some stories might sound, it does not necessarily make them false. He draws that conclusion after discussing with one of his seniors in the Fez court. Quote unquote. One day, I met the Sultan's famous wazir, Faris ibn Wadrar. I intimated to him that I did not believe in Battuta's stories, because people in the dynasty were in general inclined to consider him a liar. Whereupon the wazir Faris said to me, "Be careful to not reject such information about the condition of dynasties, just because you have not seen such things yourself." He uses the example of a boy who grew up in jail without knowing the outside world. You would be like the son of the wazir who grew up in prison and remained in there several years. When he reached the age of reason, he asked his father about the meat which he had been eating. His father told him that it was mutton, and he asked him what that was. When his father described the sheep to him in all details, the son said, "Father, you mean it looks like a rat?" The same happened later about beef and camel meat. The only animals he had seen in prison were rats, and so he believed that all animals were of the same species as rats. Ibn Khaldun wars against excessive incredulity. Regarding history, of course, people might exaggerate. But it does not mean that people should automatically dismiss things that seem extraordinary to their eyes, whereas they remain in the sphere of the possible. So, Ibn Khaldun states that historians must be armed with some essential tools to be fully qualified: a deep understanding of political and social dynamics, economics and wealth production, human moral and physical nature, geography, and logic. A historian should also keep in mind that actual history might be extremely unpleasant and must be suspicious if history becomes excessively flattering. Because if the so-called history you are reading tends to make you overly proud, chances are that you are not reading history, but propaganda. Ibn Khaldun's analysis and intuition might be right, but he was too much ahead of his time, and was therefore relatively lonely, as he did not generate a school of thought immediately after him. And in history, being right alone is being wrong. Several centuries after his death, it is more than pertinent to build more on top of his legacy and readjust his theories to our own times, taking into account the changes that occurred after his death, and keep in mind which patterns have remained intact. This, actually, was Ibn Khaldun's wish. Quote unquote. Perhaps some later scholar, aided by the divine gifts of a sound mind and of solid scholarship, will penetrate into these problems in greater details than we did here. He may gradually add more problems until the discipline I created is completely presented. Allah knows and you do not know. If you enjoyed that video, don't hesitate to like it and spread it to people you think it would be beneficial to. Your constructive feedback and reflections are very welcome. Assalamu alaikum and see you next time.